Ruven, who's obviously in very senior leadership at UNHCR, and Mona, who's worked on these issues as a practitioner, a scholar in U.S. government, and now at USIP. Thank you for joining us, Ruven and Mona. Well, to kick things off, Ruven, I'd love to start with you, and if you could help just set the scene a little bit, if you will, in terms of, in your work at UNHCR, what are the kinds of unique or disproportionate challenges that women and girls face in conflict zones? What are you seeing, and what do people here need to understand in terms of what that experience is like?
Thank you, Mayesha, and thanks a lot for inviting me to this forum. It's really great to be here and a welcome change from my daily work. Just to set the scene a little bit, right now we are talking about 114 million people who are forcibly displaced in the world today. So that's a population of a medium-sized country, essentially. So this is really just to let you know what the dimension of the problem is. And then remember that more than half of those 114 million are women and girls. And they are completely and disproportionately impacted by conflict itself. I mean, all you have to do is open the newspapers or read in the social media, from Ukraine to Sudan to Myanmar. Sexual violence has become a weapon of war. It's parties to conflict, whatever their ideology, whatever their motivations are, they see women as fair game. And we are seeing this more and more. I mean, just in Sudan alone, we responded to 4.2 million GBV cases as of October last year. So this is really, I could not provide the sort of a description that really would be as compelling as just providing you with those statistics. The fact is that 4.2 million incidents are literally 4.2 million women and girls. There's a human tragedy and a human face behind each one of those digits. And that's something we really need to know. And then women are also and girls are also disproportionately impacted by displacement itself. So it's not just a conflict. It's even once they have left the area of conflict, they go into a refugee camp. Something as banal as having no lights or poor lighting, or not having separate quarters for women because they're all put together with men. All of these can lead to incredibly precarious and risky situations for women. Same thing, we as the UN Refugee Agency, there are lots of conflict zones. We are operating in pretty much every conflict zone in the world today, bearing in mind that there are 55 active conflicts going around globally right now, and they increase by the minute. And so we are present in all of these locations, but there are certain areas to which UNHCR staff cannot go with the best will in the world. And there, because of that constrained humanitarian access, that means that the humanitarian systems are weakened. We are not there. We are not able to provide assistance in place. And the women who are basically in these settlements or locations where we cannot access tend to again bear a disproportionate brunt of the impact of this lack of humanitarian assistance and lack of humanitarian access. So what happens? Food insecurity, they are impacted the most. They go into negative coping mechanisms, whether it's prostitution, whether it's sex for food. Again, this is not something you haven't heard of. I'm sure you've seen this or read about this in practically every protracted humanitarian situation. And, these are the and access to critical health services, including reproductive health services. Again, women and girls are disproportionately deprived of this and feel the impact even more. I could go on for ages, but I think I'll stop there.
No, thank you. And I really appreciate you kind of giving that range of experiences and challenges. And Mona, let me see if you want to join in on this conversation a little bit with respect to this question before we move on.
Absolutely, Mayesha. Thank you, and thanks to Foreign Policy for inviting me. And let me welcome all of you to USIP, to our beautiful building. Everything that Ruven said, we are seeing in spades in the Middle East and North Africa. This is a region that is really has been plagued by conflict for more than 2 decades. Iraq, of course, the conflicts arising from the Arab uprisings, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and of course now the conflict we're witnessing in Gaza. And in all of these conflicts, we are seeing the vulnerability of women and children and the ways in which they are disproportionately affected by conflict. So in Gaza, we've seen, for example, now the UN estimates there are some 19,000 children who have been orphaned. So children are already vulnerable. Add that in, there's an additional level of vulnerability. We're seeing some 8,000 women who are widowed. And that means they are single heads of households. And that in and of itself implicates additional vulnerabilities, additional difficulties. And this is borne out even in some of the early surveys that have already been done in Gaza, where we're seeing, for example, that women and children have, or women have, 85% of women have a more difficult time accessing humanitarian assistance than men. There are the same issues, of course, of gender-based violence in that conflict. This, sadly, is a central characteristic of conflict we're seeing all around the world. We're also seeing something else, I think, as we remember that women as caretakers often are the ones that stay behind, who do not choose to leave for safety in order to take care of elderly or disabled family members. So we're seeing this in just about every facet in Gaza, and I think it's something that we have to sort of think through in terms of what are the implications and how can we begin to address them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to both of you for those, stark and sobering, but also really important to understand comments. And I'd love to talk next a little bit about what kind of policy interventions are needed to do more and do better. And, Mona, you alluded to the fact that for women and girls in conflict zones, the access to humanitarian assistance gap is wider, right? Much wider. And Ruven, one of the things you touched on in your comments, you mentioned something as simple as lights. And, this is something that those of us that have worked in the humanitarian sector and on these issues, we say lights, locks, latrines can be transformative in terms of protecting women and girls from additional violence, vulnerability, and precarity. And so let me ask you this, and Ruven, I'd love to go to you first, and then Mona, please join in. How can international cooperation be structured better to facilitate gender-focused humanitarian support in conflict zones? What would you like to see happen differently or happen more?
I think, first of all, involving the women themselves in their future, in the decisions that are being made concerning them, whether it's the past or the future. And basically, all you ladies out there, you don't really need to be told what's good for you. You know it. All you need is a forum and an opportunity to be able to express that. And I think that's really what we are pushing for and striving for as humanitarians, is to ensure that women are in peace-building processes, they're in conflict resolution mechanisms, they're in all the discussions relating to economic recovery, resilience, return in safety and dignity, either to their places of origin or their countries of origin. And that's absolutely critical. And we are actually seeing this. A lot of us humanitarians are working together on some of these situations. So in Niger, where you do have a fairly protracted refugee situation, we have what are known as opportunity villages, where you have both the refugees and the host communities living together, and where we, the humanitarians, have been encouraging the refugee women and the local women from the host communities to work together in cooperatives. And this has tremendously empowered these women from both communities to actually work together, to understand each other better, to understand where they're each coming from, but actually being an agent of their own future and their own resilience and independence. So that has really been amazingly successful. Similarly, in South Sudan, we are promoting what are known as pockets of hope, and this is essentially for returning refugees. Again, and Mona said this, some of the women elect to stay behind. And so this is, again, for the returning refugees and for the host communities who never left. So these pockets of hope, again, we are encouraging basically women to set up business associations, teaching them business skills, how to set up their own businesses, and again, achieve independence that way, and also building social cohesion as well through these efforts.
Great. Mona?
So, everything Ruven said, and I think what I would add to that is, I think particularly when we think about emergency response, how critical it is to have women's organizations front and center at the grassroots, because these are the most trusted interlocutors who can help ensure that women get the assistance that they need. The second is, Ruven, you noted some of the issues in camp settings. And one idea that's been bandied about is the need to establish women-led protection committees in camp settings to ensure that refugees or internally displaced persons are receiving the kinds of protection and assistance they need. Again, if women are the most trusted interlocutors for other women in these kinds of settings. And lastly, I think because of the trauma that accompanies conflict, that it is really essential to integrate trauma-informed practices into the distribution and provision of humanitarian assistance.
Great. Well, and actually, you know, those recommendations that you both put forward are a perfect segue to my next question, which is, what can be done to include women in peace-building efforts, and what strategies have been successful in ensuring their meaningful participation? You both touched on this a little bit, and especially as relates to humanitarian assistance and improving their condition and their well-being. But when we look to actually resolving conflict, you know, how can we make sure that women are at the forefront of and able to shape the peace-building efforts that take place? And maybe Mona, I'll go to you first and then come to Ruven.
So I think I'll start by saying it can't be emphasized enough, and you will appreciate this as a social scientist, that empirical data from study after study after study underscores that when women are included in peace processes, they are more successful, they are more durable, they are longer lasting. There's a greater kind of move toward consensus building. So it's essential that women are involved. So in order for women to be effective interlocutors, then, I think it's critical that there's investment made in women, in capacity building, in training, in workshops, in mentoring. The other way I would think of it is bring women to the table early and often. Engage them in every level of negotiation, from grassroots to track 2, or sort of informal to more formal negotiations. And finally, I would be remiss sitting here in USIP if I didn't underscore the importance of drawing attention to the success of women peace builders. We here at USIP host, for me, the favorite event of the year, a Women Building Peace Award that highlights the work of women peace builders in key conflict zones. It's really one of the most inspiring events, I think, that we hold here.
Great. Ruven?
I think Mona's actually said pretty much whatever I wanted to say, but just to reinforce what she's saying, which is essentially the power of proximity, and really bringing in the women from the start of a crisis and not towards the end of it when you suddenly remember their presence and think, oh, they might be able to contribute something. No, bring them in right from the start, because again, they know best what is good for them and what works for them. And the other thing is community-based and community-led protection mechanisms, and that's really building on what Mona said as well, and ensuring that women have a place in that, ensuring that they have a voice, and also looking towards the future. Peace building, yes, that's the immediate sort of conflict resolution and negotiation processes, but then looking beyond that to what happens next, the solutions. Making sure that women have access, and again, this is something that we take so much for granted, making sure that they have access to civil documentation, that they have access to land and property rights, housing, land and property rights, simply a title deed that makes them independent, that makes them understand that they are a person in their own rights, and ensuring that their voices are heard in all of these different peace processes.
Great. And we're almost at time, but I just want to pick up on another thing that both of you touched on. And Ruven, when you were setting the scene at the start of this conversation, you offered some statistics to help people understand the scale and gravity of the problem. We know that we are at an unprecedented level of displaced persons worldwide. We know that we are at an unprecedented level of armed conflicts worldwide. And the other thing that's really important is that both of those things, the duration of displacement and the duration of armed conflicts, are really prolonged, right? And what we're seeing more and more is protracted situations. And so to kind of close our conversation, I'd love to ask you a little bit about what you see are the key considerations for designing long-term gender equality and empowerment of women and girls programs in post-conflict communities or in protracted settings. When we were backstage and getting ready to come up here, we were all three of us were lamenting about the fact that so often the way policy interventions and funding is designed, it's such a short-term horizon, right? And that makes it so much harder to do the important work that you do. And so what are some ways that you think, that kind of work for post-conflict communities and in protected settings can be done better? Maybe Mona, we'll go to you first,
Sure.
and then Ruven, you
Sure.
can have the last word.
So without being too wonky, I do think it's based on the comment you just made, Mayesha, I think it is important to adopt longer-term funding horizons because these challenges are, as you note, by definition, long-term. I think it's critical that women are front and center in the design and implementation of these programs. I think we should think more about the metrics we use. How do the metrics that we are using to measure the effectiveness of programs, are they in fact indicative of the challenges that we're trying to address? And lastly, I think, and we sort of talked a little bit about this as well, it's important to develop lessons learned from various experience and build on cross-regional experience so that we can learn from one another and enrich our understanding of the challenge and, more importantly, how to solve it.
Something that USIP does very well in terms of bringing peace builders from different regions together to share their experiences and share their learnings. But Ruven, last word.
I just want to say, when I first joined UNHCR about 30 plus years ago, I know I'm really old, but at that point, refugee crises typically lasted 5 years, and then there were always solutions found, and basically we kind of worked ourselves out of a job. Now the average refugee situation lasts anything between 15 to 20 to 40 years. And Afghan refugees in Pakistan and Iran have been there for 43 years now. And that's becoming more and more the typical situation. And there, I think, again, going back to what Mona said, bringing in the women right from the start, making sure that they're part of the programming, all of the activities that, and programs that are intended to better their lives. The other thing is to ensure that they have access to feedback mechanisms, even confidential ones, where they can actually tell you, yes, this program is working for us. No, this one is an abysmal failure, and you really need to be looking at different approaches. So sometimes these mechanisms have to be confidential, for cultural and social reasons, but that is critical because that's the only way they're really going to understand what long-term, what programs in the long term would work for forcibly displaced women. The other thing is basically to ensure, again, right from the start, humanitarian funding tends to be incredibly unpredictable these days, not because our traditional donors don't want to give money, but it's simply the multiplicity of crises. Last year, UNHCR responded to 43 new emergencies, in addition to the ones that we were already dealing with. So that's one new emergency every 7 or 8 days. So our traditional donors just simply can't keep up with the amount of programs and, the financing that is needed. And so we have been looking at different ways of ensuring more predictable funding, and that's looking towards non-traditional donors, such as development actors, the international financial institutions, and it's very apropos since the World Bank is having its spring meetings right now. But the World Bank has been a key player in this through their conflict and fragility policies and their refugee and hosting community financing windows under their IDA allocations. And really, because that is long-term funding, that is more predictable funding, and that also gives the space for us and the forcibly displaced women to actually look at solutions in the longer term, whether it's in that country of asylum or whether it's eventually in their countries of origin or in a third country.
Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you for sharing your insights and also really the practical strategies and suggestions that you put forward in terms of, we know this work is hard, but we can do it better, and these are some of the ways to do it. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you for everything that you're doing, and all good wishes as you continue to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mayesha. Thank you.
Please now welcome to the stage JPIGO Director